Hello, good evening. My name is Vanessa, and it is with great joy that I welcome you to the 22nd Spiritist Week of the Tri-State.
Yes, we're filled with joy tonight. 22 years we have had this wonderful event, the New York and Tri-State Spiritist Week. And for the first year is virtual. And tonight we have this great uh, speaker that's going to give us a wonderful lecture. Today we have Peter Hayes. And Peter Hayes is the president of the Spiritist Center Love and Light, Amori Louis in New Jersey. Peter Hayes is going to talk about family, challenges, and solutions. So we're going to have a lovely evening tonight. Before we do so, let's start the right way with a quick prayer and join our hearts tonight, asking our God to protect and bless the speaker of tonight and the beginning of this week of study, enlightenment. And we ask you, Lord, the permission to start the evening with Peter Hayes tonight. So be it. Peter,
Yes.
the time is yours. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody involved with the Tri-State Spiritist Federation for putting this event together. I appreciate the invitation and the support. There's really no such thing as a perfect family. Families can have great parents, wonderful parents. They can sometimes have parents that are not so good at all, or somewhere in between. But perfect parents don't exist. And this is one of the points that is made in Joanna de Angelis' book, Family Constellations, that our families are not perfect. And what she goes on to say is, we do not live in the ideal family we wish for, growing up with noble and wise spirits surrounding us. Instead, we come to a group in which our own evolutionary needs are addressed. I certainly did not have a perfect family. I'm guessing none of you have either. I made mistakes as a son. I've made mistakes as a brother. I've made mistakes as a husband, as a father, and so forth. I think all of us have made mistakes within the various roles that we play within our family. But as Joanna de Angelis says, that's to be expected. And as she puts it, we come to a group in which our own evolutionary needs are addressed. What does that mean? Well, Spiritism talks about, in talking about the process of reincarnation, question 204 from the Spirit's book, for instance, emphasizes that because of reincarnation, we have ongoing relationships. And other parts of the Spirit's book, such as family ties, which is also, by the way, mentioned in Gospel According to Spiritism, we have these ongoing relationships frequently, and therefore often families will come together to form a family. Obviously, it happens because of biology, but the point is, families are often formed because of spiritual ties, not just biological ties. Why? Because we're here to learn, because we're here to grow and to develop within our families. Now, the other point is that we are here to grow and evolve spiritually as well as physically. And in chapter 25, item 2 from the Gospel According to Spiritism, there's this little passage I'd like to share with you. It talks about, in humanity's early development, all we really cared about was how to get food, how to protect ourselves from the weather, how to not get killed by our enemies, or very likely how to not get killed while hunting and things like that. And that was about it. And human beings didn't live very long back then. But then what is pointed out in this passage from the Gospel According to Spiritism is that God gave us something that was not given to animals, and that is a constant drive for the best. Animals operate primarily on instinct, but we human beings are much more than that. Joanna de Angelis, whose book Family Constellation, by the way, is the inspiration for much of this lecture, she picks up on this idea. She describes human beings as a bio, psycho, social, spiritual animal. And she emphasizes that we cannot do without family, and that we have that natural or gregarious instinct, as she puts it, and that induces us to find a group. Now, even if we're shy, we still have that gregarious instinct because we need human contact. We need to interact with one another in order to learn. Yes, obviously families are driven by biology, but again, there's the spiritual need as well as the biological need, and that families are the opportunity for us to learn a variety of lessons. And this idea about we need family life, we need family ties, is emphasized in the Spirit's book, and it's certainly emphasized in the Gospel. And I think it's interesting that Joanna de Angelis' book, Family Constellation, actually opens with this question 775 from the Spirit's book, which is not insignificant. The question is, what would be the effect on society if family ties were relaxed? In other words, family ties matter. They are what bind a family. But what would happen if they kind of got loosened up, taken for granted, what have you? The answer is real simple. It would lapse into selfishness. Joanna de Angelis makes a very fundamental point, which is that healthy families make healthy societies. And I like how there's a couple of lines I want to share with you that she uses to kind of illustrate this point. She mentions family is the foundation upon which society's immense building is erected. So again, this idea of family being the foundation gets repeated a lot in this book. Here's another line in the book a little bit later on. She says, family is the foundation, there's that word again, upon which society is built, being the Spirit's primary school where its latent faculties are awakened. The idea of the family being a school is, again, an important theme when we think about what is the purpose of having a family in the first place. But she goes on to point out that the family is not always understood, especially nowadays, as she puts it. The family remains the primary school, the utmost important for the personality's foundation and its effective development through which the Spirit acquires ultimate knowledge. Again, it's interesting that she mentions that nowadays, in particular, the family is not always understood. There's a misinterpretation going on. But again, she uses that word foundation and the idea of family being a primary school. And she goes on to say that families certainly do face a lot of challenges today. Before I share with you some of what Joanna de Angelis says, I'm going to share with you some of the issues that families face that I think most of you are familiar with. They include divorce, abuse, money, lack of communication, and especially nowadays, a lot of families have trouble in which technology creates emotional separation. How many people are a little too fond of their cell phones, too fond of the internet, and so forth. Other issues affecting family is that divorce rates have gone up. Roughly 50% of all marriages end in divorce. The average marriage, when it ends in divorce, is somewhere around 10 to 11 years on average. Some of the reasons for divorce are lack of commitment, infidelity, abuse, money. And Joanna de Angelis, if you were to boil it all down, just in real basic terms, probably one of the bigger problems that families have to contend with is psychological immaturity. So many families have this problem, one way or another. And what she says is, as she puts it, perplexed by the distressed adults, the immature and irresponsible young hearts let themselves be dragged by utopias of pleasure, neglecting crucial obligations toward the family and the home, which are in fact blessings. Instead, they let go and throw themselves into the abyss of desperate hallucinations, plotting against the family institution. This is a mouthful. A couple of implications in this are that word phrases like utopias of pleasure and people throwing themselves into the abyss of desperate hallucinations implies that people's focus is a little off. People are chasing after illusions. Certainly one of the things Spiritism emphasizes is that everything we experience here on earth, we're here to learn, we're here to grow, we're here to be in our bodies. All of that's very important. But we also have the perspective of being a spirit in the spirit world, and which our perspective broadens a great deal. And so it's easy to be here on earth and kind of lose sight of some of the more important and deeper purposes for why we're here in the first place. And she touches, Joanna de Angelis does, touches on some of the illusions that people allow themselves to get drawn into. Some other points that she makes is that modern life in general has had a huge impact on families, and not always for the best. For instance, she says the apparent failure of the unions of matrimony and of those descending from it is not caused by the family, rather by the crumbling of ethics and morals, as they are victimized in the process of adaptation to the modern days. Such days are marked by the enslavement of passions and instincts as individuals obsess over the attainment of distracting things and addicting fetishes enabled by technology. You may have noticed sometimes these sentences are a little abstract, but they say a great deal. And these two sentences have a lot of different points to be made. For instance, the family is not necessarily the problem, even though people want to blame things on the family. Yes, families can be dysfunctional, but that's not the real point. Sometimes people question, why do we need a family in the first place on some level? But she's saying that when she talks about the crumbling of ethics and morals, why is that happening? Well, one possibility, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, is that we have had a lot of intelligence, development of intelligence in modern life. Has morality kept up with it? So when she says the crumbling of ethics and morals, does that mean that we don't have any? Or maybe morality has not really caught up with all the changes? That's a big point, I think, and something to think about. And she then goes on to talk about enslavement of passions and instincts, which I'll elaborate on soon. But sometimes we get a little too addicted to some of the choices that we have in modern life. And that's what she's dropping a big hint about. And then she talks about as individuals obsess over the attainment of distracting things. So there's that theme again of people chasing after stuff that's not as important as it might seem. It's kind of like people have a lot of addictions, all kinds of emotional addictions. There can be physical addictions, of course, but she's suggesting that people are allowing some of the choices they have to misdirect what really matters. And then she mentions addicting fetishes. Well, fetish by its nature means too much preoccupation with a particular object, sometimes more so than people. And then enabled by technology, again, a phrase that implies that in today's world, we can get access to pretty much anything we want pretty fast. So she's talking about a lot of the problems that we're facing. But this issue about modern life is a tricky one. After all, she says we've been trying to adapt to modern life. And she describes it as a victimization as we adapt to modern life. That doesn't mean modern life is bad. It means that as we're trying to adapt to modern life, things have gotten askewed. What does that mean? Well, first of all, society has changed a lot in the last 60, 70 years. That's within my lifetime. I know a man's not supposed to reveal his age, but I will tell you anyway and throw caution to the wind. I turned 60 this year. And if you do the math, that means I was born in 1960. So during my lifetime, the civil rights movement happened, the counterculture movement happened, the women's liberation, modern women's liberation movement happened, sexual revolution happened. That is, all of these things, and they were happening before the 1960s and into the 1970s. There were currents of it happening before, but they really began to take off in the 1960s. Also, I'll tell you something else about myself. I was born in Berkeley, California. This picture that you're looking at is a picture of the free speech movement in 1964 that happened at UC Berkeley, one of the best public universities in the world. And this picture, by the way, was taken by my father. And I have over 200 pictures of this historic event. Why was it historic? Because the free speech movement, this one in 1964, which was primarily a local issue, but it became the foundation for all the protests that came afterwards. And it was an example of how protests were becoming better organized. All the stuff going on today about Black Lives Matter and all that, a lot of it is connected to, of course, the civil rights movement, which was also happening at this time, but the way in which these protests occur, some of them are a result of events like this. So the counterculture movement, the free speech movement was happening in my backyard. And the thing is that what was going on back then? People were challenging all kinds of things. People were challenging racism, which was systemic. People were challenging sexism, which was also systemic and went back decades and centuries. People were challenging the way institutions could be hypocritical, the way they would be misleading, the way they could be manipulative. And in general, there was a lack of trust in our institutions. And people also were beginning to question the American dream, meaning that, yes, it was important to be responsible, to get work and take care of one's family. But for some young people, if that was expected of them and they just did it because it was expected of them, that was starting to bother people. And needless to say, there was a big disconnect between the younger generation, which was questioning a lot of things about the way society was structured, and the older generation, which really didn't understand. And in addition to that, there was, generally speaking, a lot of emotional turbulence. And all of this had a huge impact on families. It affected families in ways that were difficult. My parents divorced when I was about 5. About the same time, my father took this picture. And I'll tell you a little bit more in just a moment about that. But there was, in general, a lot of questioning about the way society was structured, and people were trying to get away from the way in which society can be constrictive or even rigid. And so people were wanting to have more of a say in some of their personal affairs. That would, of course, would connect to the sexual revolution, which certainly had its effects on family. For instance, there were a number of court decisions starting in the 1960s that really had profound effect on families. For example, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. That was a Supreme Court ruling that basically said that it was unconstitutional to have laws that prohibited people's right to have birth control because it interfered with marital privacy. After my mother and father separated, my mother went to UC Berkeley. She wanted to have a major life change, and she got a PhD and became a professor of English. And my mother also was very, very supportive of the women's liberation movement. And I remember one of the things she said to me, because it was through her that I first understood this. The reason the modern women's liberation movement was even possible was because of birth control and laws like this, which then made birth control obtainable. The pill came out in 1960, started to get distributed. By 1965, there were more women on the pill. And yes, it had its repercussions, but it was one of those examples of scientific progress combined with social attitudes that were changing already, which then created a profound change, but certainly has had an effect on families in all sorts of ways. Other things that happened in the 60s, no-fault divorce began just over 50 years ago. California was the first state. This had a huge effect on families. It used to be that you had to be able to come up with a reason for getting a divorce. Nowadays, you don't. You just want to say, I don't want to be married, and that's it. Other things that happened, the very controversial Roe versus Wade in 1973, which meant that a woman had a right to choose an abortion. Obviously very controversial to this day. Country's almost evenly divided on that issue. There was also, within less than the last 20 years, there were still laws on the books in which it was possible to be arrested for a homosexual activity between two consenting adults. That got overturned by the Supreme Court. And along those same lines, only 5 years ago, the right to same-sex marriage. And generally speaking, the Supreme Court has tended to base its rulings on the argument that personal autonomy, in terms of the way we want to define our relationships, our private relationships between consenting adults, our private sexual relations, that government did not have the right to pass laws prohibiting that. And so the rulings have been in many ways consistent, but needless to say, these have all had their impact on families. And these are just some of the social changes that have occurred in the last 60 to 70 years. I couldn't begin to go into more of them at this point. I don't have the time, but you get the idea. Now, Joanna de Angelis warns us that this has led to some problems. For instance, she says, eroticism, rampant nowadays, prevents individuals from getting to know each other and living in harmony. Instead, it gives way to a sex-based relationship, resulting in frustrating consequences as the misdirected libido takes over. And then she goes on to mention that the lonely egotists unite, already prepared for the separation by practicing indifference to one another. And then she says, a common behavior fueled by society's consumer-driven philosophy in which all is disposable, including human affection. Well, is sex before marriage bad? I don't think she's really necessarily saying that. And it is a part of modern life. But is there sexualization in our culture? Yes, of course there is. Through the mass media, through films, music, you name it. And in this country, in the United States, one of the things we have to contend with is that we live in a capitalist society. And so pretty much everything can be turned into a commodity in which it is bought and sold. And of course, the sexualization of a lot of things as a way of being enticements to people is certainly been used and very deliberately. And this can interfere with the ability for people to really getting to knowing one another. Sometimes people do jump into a sex-based relationship. Are all sex-based relationships bad? Not necessarily, but at the same time, think of it this way. What about those who pretty much can only have those kinds of relationships? After all, it's easy for many people to be madly passionate in love and believe it for like a couple of weeks, maybe a month or a few months. Try being in love with someone for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. That requires something very different, the ability to accomplish that. And so she's, I think, warning us that we have to be careful. I mean, what I just told you is that essentially emotional relationships are very important. And you may listen to that and go, well, yes, of course, Peter, we know this. And I would say, yes, I'm sure you do know this. But why do so many people make this mistake? Why do so many people, one way or another, get this tripped up somehow? Sometimes people think they're in a serious relationship, and yet at the end of the day, maybe not as serious as one might think. It can happen very easily. And so Joanna de Angelis is saying that we just need to be careful about the way in which couples start to develop a relationship. Now, question to ask. Have all these changes that have occurred in society in just the last 60, 70 years, have they been a disaster? Well, does that mean that all the changes have caused marriages and families and society just to fall apart? Has it all been a huge mistake? There's a passage from Genesis, part of the codification in Spiritism, chapter 18, which is called Sign of the Times. And yes, that is the theme for Spirits Week. Item 2 has got a passage that I'd like to share with you, and it goes essentially like this. Our globe, like everything that exists, is subject to the law of progress. It evolves physically through the transformation of the elements that compose it, and morally by the purification of incarnate and discarnate spirits. These two progresses follow each other and run parallel to each other, for the perfecting of the dwelling is always in keeping with that of its inhabitants. So what does this mean? The law of progress is part of human nature. And we have the evolution of the planet. Spiritism certainly believes in evolution, but there's also a hint here when it talks about the purification of incarnate and discarnate spirits, that there's obviously spiritual evolution as well. And the law of progress, which we always go forwards, we don't go backwards. As I mentioned before, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we have a capacity to have a drive for the best. In other words, put it this way, God gave us the capacity to develop our intelligence, which meant that we had the capacity to study, the capacity to grow and to learn, and of course, that means science, and science gives us the capacity to provide what we lack. All of that is good, and it's expected. It's part of God's intention, as this is implied in Spiritism. And therefore, when we think about what has gone on in the last 60, 70 years, just to focus on that, has it led to excesses and abuses? Of course. Is there a lot of selfishness today? Yes. Hedonism? Yes, at times. Narcissism? A lot. People sometimes think that they're entitled to do more or less whatever they feel like. But Does that mean that everything that happened in the last 60, 70 years in terms of social changes, is it all bad? Of course not. And again, to complain about modern life and act as though it's been a big, huge mistake, that's incompatible with the law of progress. What it implies is maybe we need to understand a little better how to process everything that's happened, because it's all happened very recently, I said, within my lifetime. And so Spiritism talks about the need to have free will. Free will is a very important component in our spiritual development. We're not a bunch of robots just kind of moving, going through the motions. So when we think about all the changes that have occurred, it's really more of an invitation that rather than lament all the things going on today that are causing issues for us, we simply, well, not simply, but we need to be able to really work on making wiser choices. We need to learn how to develop our moral capacity so that it keeps up with our intelligence and with the advances made via our intelligence. We need, as I said before, time to really process what has gone on. How could we have processed everything in such a short time? And in addition to that, we need to be able to learn how to make more mature choices. Again, I mentioned before in her book, Family Constellation, Joanna de Angelis stresses psychological immaturity is a problem with families. It's a problem in general. And of course, where do we learn to grow up? But within our families. That's where it should be happening. And so, again, we need to think more expansively about many of the changes that have occurred and what they imply for us. Now, in terms of how to ensure a family is loving and emotionally healthy, Joanna de Angelis has some suggestions for us. To start with, the family environments are better nourished when the parents, the children, the siblings, the grandparents, and so forth, when they all either understand or are guided to understand the roles within their families. So when people begin to understand what is my position within the family, it begins to help. And Joanna de Angelis makes some suggestions about, first, starting with the couple, because we were talking before about the family as a foundation for society. But what's the foundation of the family? It begins with the relationship between the couple that are going to start the family. So Joanna de Angelis says the parents, would-be parents, if you will, need the emotional foundation for themselves and for each other. It needs to, the more solid that relationship is to begin with, the easier everything that comes from it will be. And therefore, before couples try to start a family, you can ask a very important question, which I've kind of hinted at before. What's the real nature of that relationship? Is it based on mutual love? Is it based on acceptance, long-lasting companionship, or is it more of a sex-based relationship, or maybe some other physical central desires, possibly drinking, possibly drugs? Unfortunately, that happens with some relationships. And again, a lack of awareness can lead to this becoming a problem later on. Again, sometimes people think they're serious, and yet are they really able to handle the emotional changes and the challenges that happen in a relationship over time? And this is why I think Joanna de Angelis is stressing a point about love, in which she says love is fundamental for a legitimate, affectionate relationship. Love is the foundation. And it can never be discarded or replaced by behavioral eccentricities or moral ailment from either partner. So in a way, you could think of it like this. The family is the foundation for society. Healthy families make healthy societies as a whole. the more families are healthy to begin with. The relationship between the couple that starts the family is the foundation of that family. And therefore, love, genuine love, not love that's mad and passionate for a few weeks or a few months or whatever, but genuine love that can last, that's the foundation of the couple. So it's like a foundation within a foundation. And when this emotional relationship is more solid, then it's a lot easier for all the things that follow. For instance, when parents start to decide they're going to have children, Joanna de Angelis quotes or paraphrases a comment from Maria Montessori. Maria Montessori was the very innovative and very influential educator, had a big influence on childhood education from the 19th century, primarily the 19th century and the very early 20th century. And she was asked, Maria Montessori, when should parents start the education of their children? And her reply was about 20 years before they're born. So what she's suggesting with that comment is that parents, would-be parents, need to work on themselves. We all need to do that. If we think we're going to have a family, we need to work on ourselves and start kind of preparing. That need to prepare is essential. And that she says, Joanna de Angelis, that we need to prepare ourselves emotionally in order to safely guide and educate the future children. And then there's this line which I really like. Life is not improvisation. And then she says it's the result of superior planning and needs to be led with serenity and confidence. I like that. Life is not improvisation. We could all write that one down and maybe pin it to our heads if necessary. But it's a very important point. We can't just kind of decide, oh yeah, one day I'm going to have a family, or hey, let's have a family now. Okay, we need to really reflect on this as much as possible and start making those preparations in advance. Along these same lines, once parents do have children, they need to make children their priority as much as possible. That they're invited. I like how she puts it. Parents are invited by life to change their existential objectives. She likes that phrase, existential objective, a lot. What is the nature of our being? What is the purpose of our existence? And it's one thing when you're younger, if you want to spend more time exploring different avenues of life and maybe taking some time before starting a family. A lot of people are doing that nowadays, of course. And yet when the time finally comes to make that adjustment, and it is an adjustment, trust me, then we need to be ready to go for it. Also, she is, I think, what she's suggesting here is that parents need to do the best they can in terms of making children their priority. And the reason I say that is because, let's face it, most parents, if there are two parents in a family, they're working. Most of the time it's both, for often. And so it can be very difficult to spend time with one's children. But as much as possible, even outside of work, the children should be a priority. Sometimes people will use work or career or whatever as an excuse to distance themselves from their families. It can happen. Yes, obviously there are people, many people work long, hard hours, and that's part of the modern reality. But it's not, it's about the quality of time, certainly, and it's about making that emotional adjustment in which the children are the primary focus as much as possible. She goes on to say that, again, going back to this idea that the relationship between a couple must be solid to begin with, that children are smart. And children observe, and they pick up on what's going on between mom and dad, or even with a single parent, by the way. Many of the things, I will just quick side note, not a side note, but many of the issues I talked about in terms of what can affect a relationship certainly can apply to single parents from the perspective of the following. Obviously, some people make a life choice to be a single parent, but how many parents who are single became that way because of some of the issues that I tried to address that Joanna de Angelis talks about in her book, Family Constellation. So going back to this, the example that parents set through the way they interact with each other is really important. They're being observed. And I like how Joanna de Angelis puts this. He says the examples that parents give, if they do that, if they demonstrate and practice unconditional love, respect, and patience toward their children, very likely their children will become warm, friendly, and pleasant. When children feel they're loved unconditionally, it makes all the difference in the world. And that is assuming that a child's development is happening normally, because as Joanna de Angelis points out, there are, of course, as she puts it, behavioral disorders, or when certain children are victims of abnormal phenomena, as she puts it. One way to think of that is any children that have some kind of emotional issues, physical issues that might be affecting their behavior, which can be happening from a Spiritist perspective. It does say about that. When families have these situations with children, it can be some kind of trial or atonement, as it were, for something that happened in a past incarnation. That's one way to understand that. Even if that's not the case, when we think about the law of progress emphasizes we're all here to learn. So everything therefore has a purpose. And the purpose of having a child with issues like that is it's an opportunity for parents to learn a lot. Patience would certainly be one of them, how to love unconditionally no matter what, and so forth. A big point that Joanna de Angelis makes is that in order for a family to be strong, that is, to overcome any moral atrophy, it helps to think about or be conscious of what the purpose of the home environment is, and that it should be embodied by responsible, profound love that needs to be lived. In other words, put love into practice. And to overcome, as she puts it, shallow trivialities. Some of the things that I mentioned before that she was talking about, addictions to passion, behavioral eccentricities, as she likes to put it, and stuff like that. I think we get the idea if we think about it a little bit. And what she's saying is that, shallow trivialities are, as she puts it, championed by immature psychology. There's that word again. And again, gets repeated in this book more than once, which tells me it's important. A lot of people have issues with immaturity. And then she goes on to say that when this consciousness, that is awareness of making profound love profound, making unconditional without any conditions whatsoever, all of that is what's part of the home. And the more a family can do that and practice it, the more it's liable to protect it from problems outside of the family. I'll give you a very quick example. If you have, say, a teenager who is in a school where there's some stuff going on that's not so wonderful, if the teenager has the right foundation from his or her family, then it's more likely, not a guarantee, but more likely that that teenager will not choose to participate in some of the strange behavior that they can see. I certainly saw plenty of things going on in my high school that were not so wonderful. So these things obviously happen. But the more children get that foundation of love, mutual respect, and so forth, the more likely they will use their free will wisely and make choices that protect them as well as the family from, as she puts it, Joanna de Angelis puts it, anarchy and chaos. Some comments that Joanna de Angelis makes about children. If couples do not choose to have children, that's obviously a choice. Not everybody wants to be a parent. Not everybody's meant to be a parent. So that's fine. But if a couple could have children and maybe it's part of their life plan to have children, again, when you think about reincarnation, spirits plan in advance before coming to this world. So if part of the plan was to have children and they don't, then they may be ignoring a big opportunity. But even if that's not the case, Joanna de Angelis cautions that when couples do not have children, their selfish tendencies may begin to intensify. Something to be mindful about. And she goes on to say that in the family constellation, children are essential, and that without them, the union between the partners perhaps could weaken. However, I should add to that, couples should not be having children to fill a void in their relationship, because that's different. Rather, the reason to have children is that it can certainly bring a couple together positively. It can unite them in many ways positively. And it also helps the parents to acquire self-confidence, responsibility, and so forth. Certainly, parents usually learn a lot more from their children than the other way around. And this is, I think, one of the points that Joanna de Angelis is suggesting here. Other comments about children, that children owe their parents gratitude or forgiveness when parents make mistakes. I'm talking about, this is when parent or children start to grow older and become more aware of their family environment. But certainly, the reason we owe our parents gratitude is because they gave us life. As she said here, children owe their parents even their commitment, even if the commitment's not fully carried out. Children owe their parents gratitude and respect for the blessed opportunities to be reborn in the physical body, in the home, needed for their evolution. Again, Spiritism emphasizes through family ties that the purpose of a family is to have that opportunity to learn. Every time we come back to this world, it's an opportunity to learn and to grow. That is a gift. And our parents, we have to be thankful for that. And we also need to be able to forgive our parents even when they've made mistakes. Both my parents are gone. They had a lot of wonderful qualities. They're very talented, very smart people, very likable in many ways. But I found it interesting that both of them told me later in life that they were rather immature when they were together. Obviously, most people's parents have made mistakes. Probably all parents make mistakes. I said before, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. And it's important that we, all of us, know how to forgive anything that may have happened. Obviously, if there was real heavy-duty abuse and worse, that's hard to forgive. And forgiveness has a lot of different layers to it. I don't have time to get into this, but there's different levels of forgiveness that Spiritism talks about in the codification. Put simply, it's not about forgetting, but it is about letting go and not hanging on. Sometimes it's a little too easy as an adult to hang on to victimhood. Oh, my family was dysfunctional, therefore I can't function. Well, I'm not downplaying the seriousness of families that are dysfunctional and the effects that can have. But at the same time, we have to do our best to try and adapt and make do with whatever environment we grew up in. And again, it's part of the learning process. So this is very important. Some comments that Joanna de Angelis makes about siblings. Parents can certainly notice the kind of relationship their siblings have. And sometimes siblings have visible affection and they really get along and they bond well. Other times they can be at each other's throats. Sometimes there's a lot of fighting. But the thing to pay attention to is there's different types of fighting. There's squabbling, and then there's like continuous aggressions. Sometimes it's petty, sometimes it's more malevolent than that. And parents really need to pay attention to this. And that's the point that Joanna de Angelis is making. They need to pay attention, they need to be present, and they need to be vigilant in terms of trying to do their best to contribute to the harmony, meaning how do you learning to set boundaries, loving boundaries. Mr. Rogers, to use the expression, the TV personality, Mr. Rogers, use the expression loving limits with families and with children. And it's absolutely true. Assuming that there's not a real serious problem between two siblings, which may be a sign of issues of a relationship in a previous incarnation. That's one way to understand that. But whatever's going on between two siblings, parents need to be paying attention. Obviously, if they're getting along and support each other, that's wonderful. But when there's some acrimony between two siblings, then the parents need to set boundaries as needed and try to guide and create the right harmony and understanding among all members of the family. And part of that can be done by just articulating what some of the expectations are. An important point also, and again, this kind of reverts back to a point I made before, that the union and respect between parents that they have both for each other and for their children is essential. All of that helps to create the right balance and harmony. And this helps children to become grounded. And also, again, the more they get guidance from their parents in these ways, the more it helps with their own evolutionary experience. Again, if we think of families as a process of spiritual evolution, that's a great way to think about what families are really about in the first place. Some other comments Joanna de Angelis makes about siblings. Parents should not favor one over the other. Sometimes you've got the good child and then you've got the black sheep. Well, the black sheep, as it were, I say that in quotes, deserves love and attention. It can be easier to spend more time or like the easier going child. But the one that is a little more of a handful is the one that also needs care and attention, perhaps a lot more in some ways. But parents should not avoid favoring one over the other. And Joanna de Angelis cites the Bible story Cain and Abel as something to avoid. Okay. She also talks about the duty of siblings, which is that they should try to make the most of their coexistence with each other. That means they'd be able to help each other out, should be trying to grow together. They should develop a feeling of mutual respect and brotherhood, despite being at times perhaps unable to love one another in initial stages, which is understandable. After all, kids can get into territorial disputes and all that stuff. I mentioned it near the beginning of this presentation that I made mistakes as a brother, but I am generally speaking very thankful to my brother for several reasons. All the things I learned, the guidance I got from my older brother when I was young, certainly the ways in which my brother has helped me, and I hope I've helped him back at times in adulthood. And we live, on opposite sides of the country, so we don't see each other too often. But I certainly appreciate this comment here about the importance of siblings learning to really develop feelings of respect. It doesn't mean they're always going to agree. There can still be those things that happen between siblings. And I'm sure those of you who have siblings know what I'm talking about. But at the foundation, as it were, should be, or hopefully is based on respect. Unfortunately, there are siblings who really can't stand each other well into adulthood. And it's sad when that happens. But if one thinks of it and is conscious of it, it can be an opportunity to try to repair something that happened before. again, going back to this idea of the role of the family helping with society, she does say that biological siblings serve as an experimental field for the molding of a harmonious society. And again, part of that idea is that the healthier the relationship between siblings is encouraged, the more it can help to society as a whole, not just between siblings, but all members of the family. I'm going to start to wrap up, and just a general comment, important comments about grandparents. Joanna de Angelis basically says that grandparents certainly play an important role, but they should not replace or judge parents. Okay, first part of this sentence. Grandparents certainly can play an important role, especially with single parents. Sometimes grandparents are a real godsend in those situations. But grandparents have to understand their role within the family, as I mentioned before. That means that they should not try to replace the parents. And again, this is assuming that the parents are alive, because sometimes there are situations, of course, where children are left or given or come under the care of their grandparents because both parents are gone. But assuming that the parents are around, grandparents should not be trying to micromanage the rearing of their adult children's children. And they should not be judging parents. They may not agree with the decisions their children make, their adult children, but they have to respect them. And it's a lot like when we, as parents, were watching our children grow up. There comes that point where once our children become adults, we have to know how to ease off and not try to control things, because we really can't. It's one thing to make some suggestions every now and then, but to try and control an adult child, that creates a lot of friction and should be avoided. And hopefully, if parents put the right amount of time into their children's upbringing to begin with, that will be less of an issue, most likely. By the way, the more parents can spend as much time as possible with their children during about the first 6 to 7 years, the better. Maria Montessori makes that point, that it's really, really important in those beginning stages, that process of bonding from the minute a child is born well into 6, 7, but even beyond that, parents need to be involved. And then when they become teenagers, parents can start to back off a little bit, but keep an eye out. But you as children start to individuate, it's important for parents to know how to make those adjustments and not be, to put it bluntly, not be control freaks, which can happen. Okay, so to conclude, as I said at the beginning, families are not meant to be perfect. It is a given. I like how Joanna de Angelis puts it. She describes families as a permanent training camp where feelings and emotions are stirred. Oh boy, are they ever. Ultimately renewing and guiding them towards the positive creation of future projects. So we're here to learn. We're here to make mistakes. It's fine. We shouldn't be upset if we don't have the postcard Norman Rockwell image of family or something like that. Most of us don't. It's wonderful when a family environment is loving. It can be a great joy. But if there's turmoil and frictions at times or disagreements or whatever, it's to be expected. And we need to do our best to try to learn from one another and work on any issues with one another as much as we can. And the purpose of that is you're really planting seeds for the future. This phrase, guiding the members of the family towards the positive creation of future projects. Our relationships with one another are ongoing. That's the point made in question 204 of the Spirit's book. Because of the process of reincarnation, our relationships are continuous. So it behooves us to do what as much as we can here and now. Also, a lot of what I've been saying, and a lot of what I think Joanna de Angelis has been stressing in her book, Family Constellation, is that we need to be as grounded as possible. And the way we do this is to have lots of love, lots of compassion, lots of mutual respect for our family members, and forgiveness when necessary, guidance, and so much more. A lot of these qualities that are certainly emphasized in the teachings of Jesus, but these are universal qualities. So whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, these values, moral values, apply. They are universal. I think they're qualities of living that all of us should be able to agree upon. Even though these teachings are emphasized by Jesus, and yes, they're universal, I'm going to wrap up by quoting Jesus in the following way. This is from Matthew chapter 7, 24, verse 24 to 27. This is actually from Sermon on the Mount. And in that sermon, he sums up a lot of his teachings, the things some of them I just mentioned. And then he goes on to say, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with this quote. I like this one a lot. I often come back to it and I think about it. When we think about our house, our spiritual house, if you will, our emotional house, when it is on the foundation of rock, that means that it's built on love, compassion, mutual respect, the capacity to forgive, the capacity to let go, and so forth. Then we're on solid ground. And when we do that within our families, the environment can change and be healthier. If we insist on being selfish, if we're full of pride, if we're inflexible, if we strongly believe in my will, my way, and I'm not going to change at all because I'm a rugged individualist or whatever it is, then we're building our houses on sand. These days, you can draw your own conclusions as to what's going on. But the important thing is that we be grounded. And so the more we can do our best to try and appreciate the families that we're in, appreciate the opportunities to learn within our families, the more we can benefit as a whole. Thank you very much. By the way, I would just like to say, like to thank my friend Patricia, who helped put together the look of the PowerPoint. I provided the content and she helped me with the PowerPoint. I'd like to thank her. And once again, I'd like to thank all of those who've been involved in putting together Spiritist Week. It's been a lot of work and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this and to share this with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We are so grateful to have you kicking off the lectures in this wonderful week we have ahead of us. You have given us so much tonight. We have received a lot. And thank you also for sharing your personal experiences with us. That gave us beautiful, beautiful stories to remember. And your father's photography was amazing. I had to say that. Tomorrow we're going to have Cesar Ferri at 8 o'clock. It's going to be the Gospel in Pandemic Times. That one is going to be held in Portuguese. Okay, 8 o'clock New York time. And now to end this beautiful evening, Vanessa is gonna end it up with a prayer for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. It was wonderful, really wonderful. And so I will ask everyone to close your eyes, to calm your heart, and to raise your thoughts to our Almighty. Dear God, thank you so much for this night, for this opportunity to gain so much knowledge and wisdom through the words of our dear Peter, that brought so much knowledge for us to understand how our families are so essential for our spiritual growth, for our mission here to attain peace and love in our hearts. I ask you, my Lord, I ask Jesus, our Master, that we can bring this wisdom and put in our hearts to fill our relationships in our families and all the relationships with our siblings, grandparents, and friends that are too important in our lives, that we use all those words of Joanna de Angelis, that we can have a family who is healthy and loving through lots of love, compassion, mutual respect, and forgiveness. I will ask you to bless our Spiritist week, all the people that are working for this week to make it this event beautiful and to have a really loving moment in our lives. Thank you so much. Bless us all and stay with us today and forever. So be it.